I'm going to start with the introduction to LJ, and we're obviously happy to welcome LJ Milone back to the Center for Spiritual Deepening series on the mystics. This year at St. John of the Cross, this year at St. John of the Cross, mystics often have a difficult relationship with the church authorities. John of the Cross knew from direct experience the personal sacrifice involved in seeing deeply into reality. I believe he has something to say to us about the times we live in and how to be. LJ has pursued faith in the world for many years. After his initial studies, he volunteered with Franciscan friars, serving the poor, incarcerated, the homeless, and the sick. He has a Doctor of Ministry in Preaching from Aquinas Institute of Theology. He also earned a master's degree in Pastoral Studies from the Washington Theological Union, where he studied with teacher and voluminous writer Ilia de Leo. As we proceed, please put any questions in the chat and LJ will address them at the end of the presentation. Please welcome LJ Milone.
Let's begin with an opening prayer. For all things. If you don't, be spiritual and temporal necessities. And keep in mind that you will neither have nor feel any more needs than those to which you desire to submit your hearts. For the poor in spirit are happier and more constant in the midst of want, because they have placed their all in nothingness of heart. Oh, happy nothingness. In 1542, John, or Juan de Yepes, is born to Catalina and Gonzalo de Yepes in Fonteveros. In 1545, his father, Gonzalo, dies. And then from 45 to 51, Catalina moved around with her children. Revelo settles in Medina del Campo. In 1559, he moves to study with the Jesuits. He does some humble work at a hospital in Medina. In 1562, St. Teresa of Avila begins a reform of the Carmelites. In 1563, John enters the regular Carmelites at Santa Ana in Medina. He then attends Salamanca University, 64 to 68. And in 1567, he's ordained a priest. That same year is a pivotal year in the history of Christian mysticism. John of the Cross meets Teresa of Avila. And Teresa wins John over to her reform. If you remember, we did Teresa, was it last year or the year before?
Last year.
And Teresa was seeking to reform the Carmelites in the 16th century. And they were pretty lax. They were not doing too great, those Carmelites. So Teresa comes along, wants to restore them to the original spirit of the desert, the contemplative ideal. And John is really attracted to that because at this time, he wanted to become a Carthusian. So in 1568, John starts the first reform house of friars in Duruelo. At 72, at Teresa's request, he becomes the vicar and confessor at the Convent of the Incarnation in Avila. In 77, this is what Peg was referring to at the beginning. On December 2nd, he is kidnapped by the regular Carmelites, and he's imprisoned in a Carmelite monastery in Toledo. In 1578, like it's something out of a movie, John escapes from prison. And in 82, he becomes prior of a community of friars in Granada, Los Martires. That same year, St. Teresa dies. Then in 1591, he moves into solitude in Andalusia, begins to suffer fevers, goes to Ubeda for care. December 14th, he dies into God. So those are some important dates in the life of St. John of the Cross. And just for reference, here's Medina del Campo. If we go back to this slide, that's where he studied and kind of where he grew up, Medina del Campo. It's in I think the same province, more or less, of Madrid. The pivotal moment, though, is when John meets Teresa. And fortunately, we have Teresa's own description. She writes, "When I spoke with this young friar," speaking of John of the Cross, "he pleased me very much. I learned from him how he also wanted to go to the Carthusians. Those are like intense hermits. Telling him what I was attempting to do, reform the Carmelites, I begged him to wait until the Lord would give us a monastery, and pointed out the great good that would be accomplished if, in his desire to improve, he were to remain in his own order, and that much greater service would be rendered to the Lord. He promised me he would remain as long as he wouldn't have to wait long. When I saw that I already had 2 friars to begin with, it seemed to me the matter was taken care of. Although I still wasn't so satisfied with the prior," talking about another friar named Antonio, "and thus I waited a while, and waited also for the sake of finding a place where they could begin." So Terry here, let's call her Terry, lovely Terry, is all about, I don't want to just reform the sisters, I want to reform the brothers, the priests too, the friars is the kind of more inclusive term there. And she had one friar, but she didn't really like him that much. His name was Antonio. But she was very impressed with Fray Juan de los Martires. And that was his name before he took the name John of the Cross. So here's what Richard Hardy writes. And he has written the best biography of St. John of the Cross. Actually, I don't know the current title. It used to be called The Search for Nothing. I forget what the current title is. But here's Richard Hardy. "Though she did not realize it immediately, it was not long before she came to see that she had finally met her match in a man." Speaking of Teresa. "All the other men Teresa had met were simply overwhelmed by her presence and abilities, and they acceded to her wishes with respect and admiration. Fray Juan de Santa Matia, on the other hand, would clearly inform her of his opinion whether or not it agreed with hers. As early as 1568, I love this, as early as 1568, she herself said that he irritated her." All right, look, just hold on for a second right there. These are 2 mystics and saints, but you have to know these are people. So Terry is, in this point, probably in her 50s. John of the Cross is probably Johnny. He's probably in his late 20s, early 30s. And even though they loved each other, they got on each other's nerves. So just something to keep in mind. These are not perfect people, and nor should we be. It's not really the point of the gospel. It's not surprising, therefore, that though she knew John, would be a most faithful and helpful servant of the reform, she chose another protege to be the superior Gracian. This young, energetic, handsome man, who had a very real zeal for the community, was especially perfect in La Madre's eyes because, get this, he always agreed with her. Fray Juan was the only one she could never really control. So isn't that just, I just love that part, because Terry's lovely. I mean, you know that from last year. But and I don't have it in these slides, but John of the Cross was small even for the time. He was like 4'3", 4'5". He was a tiny man. And they often referred to him as the little friar, you know. And it's funny that she met her match in a tiny man. Here's Duruelo, and I'm so glad we have this. We have a letter that Teresa wrote documenting her experience of going to Duruelo, the very first Reform Carmelite monastery for men. So this is where John of the Cross became John of the Cross. He stopped being John de Santa Matia, Juan de Santa Matia from the regular Carmelites. He's now a descalced Reformed Carmelite, and he's in this kind of, even though the picture there looks like it's a nice church, it wasn't like that. It was a ramshackle barn. So St. Teresa describes, when I entered the little church, I was astonished to see the spirit the Lord had put there. And it wasn't only I, for the two merchants, my friends from Medina, there were so many crosses, so many, that's weird. I never forget a little cross made for the holy water fount from sticks with a paper image of Christ attached to it. It inspired more devotion than if it had been something very expertly carved. The choir was in the loft. In the middle of the loft, the ceiling was high enough to allow for the recitation of the hours. But one had to stoop low in order to enter and hear Mass. There were in the two corners facing the church 2 little hermitages, where one could do no more than either lie down or sit. Both were filled with hay because the place was very cold and the roof almost touched one's head. Each had a little window facing the altar and a stone for a pillow, and there too, the crosses and the skulls. Now, later on, Terry will say, report how they would pray in the church and they sit in, they do their silent prayer, their contemplative prayer. They do their contemplative prayer. And because there were holes in the roof of this barn, snow would collect on their heads. Like they didn't even notice that the weather was going on. Now, this is a little extreme. Do not decorate your house with skulls. I think that kind of goes without saying. But that was kind of the culture of the time, and it kind of suggested these were people into letting go. All right, so let me give you some scenes from John's life and kind of give you a flavor of what it was like for him as a mystic, kind of in the same time as Teresa of Avila. So Terry gets elected to be a prioress at the Incarnation Monastery, where there's like 80 nuns. No, actually, there's even more. I think there's like 200 nuns. And they put her there to kind of try and contain her. She knew she needed help, so she brought John of the Cross to Avila with her. So she got John to be the confessor and spiritual guide for the nuns of her very large convent, the Incarnation. She wanted Fray Juan, that's the Spanish there, Fray Juan nearby, so they could easily discuss the reform, more conveniently work out the difficulties involved. She also knew that with him as guide, the sisters would gradually become more interested in deepening their spiritual life. There was they could only improve, because when they found out Teresa was going to be their prioress, they literally barred the door from letting her in. They were not interested in having Terry disrupt their lives. So John comes along with Terry to Avila. But his work was not limited to the monastery. The hut, which he shared with Father Herman, was very close to others occupied by the families of the workers that were in Avila. His hermitage sat in the midst of human life. Children played in the yards. Mothers shouted at them. Neighbors casually bantered across fences and in doorways. These families were as poor as his own had been in Fontiveros and Medina del Campo. He had a deep interest and love for them all, for they were his kind of people. He played with the children and taught them the rudiments of reading and writing, as well as catechism. I should also say here that John, you noted in his timeline, are we back? Can you? Okay, looks like I can see Peg blinking her eyes. I think you guys can hear me. Good. Okay, so you should know that John grew up very poor, and his dad died when they were very young. he and his brothers, he had two brothers, run around looking for work, but they were also likely of mixed blood, either Spanish Jewish or Spanish Muslim. We're not sure. They were Catholic, obviously, but they had ancestors who were from one or two position and were treated as second-class citizens. So that's kind of the background to why he was so at home with the poor people of Avila. And there's Avila right there. And there's Avila right there. Thank you, Lisa. If I cut out, I'll pause and we'll come back. Don't worry. And you can see the walls around the city. I am trying to remember exactly where the convent is, but it's hard to tell. All right, a woman in love. This is something that happened to John while he was in Avila. John was alone in his little hut in Avila one evening as he ate his meal, his meager supper. He heard someone coming through the small garden bordering his hut. As he turned from the table toward the door, he saw a beautiful young woman standing in the doorway. She lived in the city, and he had seen her there, as well as at the monastery church. She was a strikingly beautiful woman. When she began to speak, the little friar found that her message surprised him much more. She passionately blurted out her desire to have him as her lover. It seems that she had fallen madly in love with him. This is not a frequent thing that happens to friars. So they talked, but afterwards she went back to her home on the hill in Avila. Understanding the impossibility, he spoke to her calmly and gently. That was his manner of acting. So that just gives you a little taste for what he was like. He didn't, and I bring this up because he didn't act like St. Thomas Aquinas did. I think Thomas Aquinas that idea. So they sent a prostitute into his quarters to try and entice him away from being a Dominican friar. And Thomas drove the woman out with beatings, right, with a club. You know, John does not do that. John doesn't drive her away. John doesn't yell at her. John doesn't, get mad at her. He sits and talks with her. It's like, and he explains the situation, and then she goes away gently and calmly. Now, you know that John of the Cross wrote The Dark Night of the Soul. He had his own dark night. On December 2nd, 1577, John was abducted. Now, you should know the background to this. The 16th century in Spain, there were a lot of religious orders, and they all had their own revenue system. When a new religious order entered town, that may have disrupted the system. The Carmelites had everything in place, and yet here's John's new religious group, the Reformed Carmelites, disrupting the revenue stream and also the authority. It's not just the money, it's the authority. It's, all sorts of kind of worldly things. So these other Carmelites are getting really pissed off. So they abduct him. These are friars. These are monks abducting their own monk, John. And they bring him to Toledo. And 1578 in August, John escapes. Now, between these two time periods, December 77, August 78, John was kept in a prison cell just a little bit bigger than a closet. Now, again, he was a small guy, right? But this was a tiny, tiny place he was kept in. and there was light only coming through the very top. His jailer regularly took him to the dining room where all the friars, dozens, took turns whipping him while he knelt on the floor. All you need to know is that in those days, monasteries had prisons, had cells where they kept prisoners. And that can tell you the kind of level of intensity and how much punishment was a part of life back then. I mean, and let's be honest, some of them probably needed it. Some of them were, who knows? But it just tells you that they were extreme, very, very extreme. His food was scarce. He suffered all the extremes of weather in this poorly lit, excruciatingly small prison cell. And he knew he had to get out of there. So one day he made a rope, a long rope out of some laundry. And he scaled down the wall and he jumped. He had to jump the kind of remaining feet, and he almost broke his legs, I think. And then he was all right, and he found his way to some of the Reformed nuns in Toledo, and they hit him, and then they moved him secretly. And there's Toledo. Now here at Toledo, where he was kept prisoner, and I want to say, do you see how the road winds around kind of the slope there? Maybe down at the bottom, you can see there's that light shining into the water. If you look almost straight up, and then a little bit to the left, there's kind of right in the middle, a building with a bunch of trees around it. That's, I think, where the monastery was, where he was kept. In his final years, John spends more and more time in silent contemplative prayer. God had led him through a dark night into unity. And he dies into God on December 13th, 1591. And here are his major writings. So he has a lot of poetry. As a writer, he's mainly a poet. His prose works are sometimes a little meandering, and he kind of needed an editor at times. He's mainly a poet, and then he has these sayings of light and love. He also has some letters. But the four prose works are the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Dark Night, the Spiritual Canticle, the Living Flame of Love. The most polished of the four is the Spiritual Canticle. And they're all four of those works are commentaries on his own poems. The Ascent of Mount Carmel and the Dark Night are commentaries on his poem, The Dark Night, which is very much a reflection of his experience in the prison in Toledo. The Spiritual Canticle and the Living Flame are both commentaries on poetry of the same name. The Spiritual Canticle, a 40-stanza poem, and the Living Flame of Love, a 4-stanza poem. Okay, let's get into some of his teachings, shall we? We have a little bit of time here. My God and my delight, John of the Cross writes. Also, O sweetest love of God, so little known, whoever has found this rich mine is at rest. So sweetness, love, delight. The lavish love of God. That's the heart of John of the Cross's mysticism. His teaching makes no sense without the lavish love of God pouring out divine love on us. This puts the happy and delight in his path of nothingness and detachment. John knows this. He writes, a more intense and kindling of another, better love, love of the soul's bridegroom, love of God, is necessary for the vanquishing of the appetites. We'll get into what the appetites are in a moment. Ian Matthew comments, we need a love which fills us at the point we thought the enslaving loves were filling us. To transcend our mediocrity, we need a love which touches us at the threshold of our fear. John presents a God whose love does that. John trusts in a very specific God, the lavish mystery of God, giddily and gladly ready to give. The holy mystery, and this is a quote, the holy mystery is sheer grace. Sheer grace. God cannot wait to just give, give, give. Ian Matthew is a Carmelite who lives in England right now and wrote a great book on John of the Cross. He says, where God is concerned, the problem lies in our desiring too little. And growing means expanding our expectations, or rather, making God's generosity, not our poverty, the measure of our expectations. So because God is so lavish in giving us God's own life, we want to take this path called happy nothingness. But what's the problem with humanity? All the mystics have a theory for our problem with getting to God or realizing happiness. And it usually comes back to something like attachments. John of the Cross is no different. But he calls them inordinate appetites. In The Ascent, he writes, an attachment to a creature makes a person equal to that creature. The stronger the attachment, the closer is the likeness to the creature, the greater the equality. Love affects a likeness between the lover and the beloved. Anyone who loves a creature, then, is as low as that creature, and in some way, even lower, because love not only equates, but even subjects the lover to the loved creature. So he's making an argument for how we can get imprisoned in our own desires. When speaking of appetites, John means willful, inordinate, that is out of order, longings or cravings, impulses that are not rightly ordered to what is morally good, to what is beneficial to our spiritual growth. Inordinate appetites or attachments, simply put, those are the things we believe will satisfy us instead of God. They weary us, torment us, darken us, defile us, weaken us. Just take a moment and think about this. Our selfish desires exhaust us. They keep tormenting us because they keep, needing to be filled, needing to be satisfied. They darken us, meaning they kind of shut down our awareness. They defile us, and they make us weaker. The burdens and miseries of life come to us from these very ills. Most of all, our unruly, selfish desires rob us of the opportunity to enjoy God's Spirit. Now, give John a break. He's writing in the 16th century, but let's read what he has to say here. Oh, what a miserable lot this life is. He did go into prison for like 9 months and almost die, so give him a break. We live in the midst of so much danger and find it so hard to arrive at truth. The clearest and truest things are the darkest, most dubious. Consequently, we flee from what most suits us. We embrace what fills our eyes with the most light and satisfaction, and run after what is the very worst thing for us, and we fall at every step. In how much danger and fear do humans live, since the very light of their natural eyes, which ought to be their guide, is the very first to deceive them in their journey to God. And since they must keep their eyes shut and tread the path in darkness, if they want to be sure of where they are going and be safeguarded against the enemies of their house, their senses and faculties. So he paints a not so rosy picture of the human condition. Hence the need for this path. And I bring this up, this is from letter 16, was our opening prayer. This, I think, is his main message. As long as you understand it comes out of this prior theology, God is pure gift, sheer grace, lavish love, then we need the spirit of poverty and contempt for all things. And the main line there is the desire to be content with God alone. If you don't, be assured you'll fall into 1,000 spiritual and temporal necessities. I love that line because it feels like in life, there's all these necessary things we have to do, and we can get taken up in them. Keep in mind, you will neither have nor feel any more needs than those to which you desire to submit your hearts. So we hand ourselves over sometimes in the middle of these necessities. The poor in spirit are happier, more constant, even in the midst of want, because they placed their all in nothingness. And that's where they find freedom. Happy nothingness. John's happy nothingness is a spiritual state in which we are not thinking, empty of inordinate desires, utterly silent in the silence, nothing in the nothing. The soul is at rest in God within, without thinking or paying attention to one's attachments, by faith, hope, and love. Now, there's a lot there. Let's go through a little bit of it. When we remain in the spiritual state of nothingness, we're happy. It's a spiritual state, a state of the heart that is totally prayerful. To be content with God alone is to be content with nothing, since God's not a thing. And the soul must be left empty and void of all attachments, all thinking. So happy nothingness is a spiritual state in which we allow our hearts to rest in nothingness without reacting to their feelings by satisfying them. It's an inner state in which we must remain, quote, naked, empty, naked, purified of every appetite. If we stop feeding our inordinate appetites, wither I. Simultaneously, fix our desire on God alone in emptiness. So when we experience the itch of an attachment that we always scratch, binge watching Netflix, playing a game on a smartphone, complaining about work, and searching it, we can let it be and stay in emptiness. John writes, the very pure spirit does not bother about the regard of others or human respect, but communes inwardly with God, alone and in solitude as to all forms. That means without thinking. And with delightful tranquility, for the knowledge of God is received in divine silence. He also writes, souls will be unable to reach perfection who do not strive to be content with having nothing, in such fashion that their natural and spiritual desire is satisfied with emptiness. For this is necessary in order to reach the highest tranquility and peace of spirit. Hence, the love of God in the pure and simple soul is almost continually in act. We stop thinking and accept God as God in an inner emptiness. So happy nothingness is the practice of letting go of thinking while enjoying God as God, whom we often experience as nothing. And that's that real core of the dark night, by the way. It's when we really experience God as nothing, as darkness, emptiness. God's still there, but it kind of almost is painful for us. For John, it's all about prayer. All about prayer. St. John of the Cross says prayer is the one practice. And prayer as contemplative, silence within, entirely trusting in, hoping in, and loving God alone. He's always focused on those three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. Prayer then means inner nothingness. No knowledge, no possessions, no desire, no being, just trust, just hope, just love. And this prayer syncs up with the mystery of God, who's not a thing or a being, but beyond all. John says, since God is inaccessible, be careful to concern yourself with all that your faculties can comprehend and your senses feel, so that you do not become satisfied with less and lose the lightness of soul suitable for going to him. Satisfied with less might mean I'm satisfied with my feelings about God, an experience of God, or even my ideas about God, which just wind up being my ideas and not really have anything to do with God. So happy nothingness is prayer, in which the soul enjoys God alone in a silence beyond thinking, an emptiness beyond inordinate nothingness. The center of John's sketch of Mount Carmel, it's the way of prayer. Indeed, all John gives is about transferring the prayer of happy nothingness into our choices. Prayer is a practice. Happy nothingness. Oh, am I breaking up a little bit? We only have a little bit more. Prayer is the practice. Happy nothingness is a dynamic state of prayer that we cultivate in a contemplative prayer practice and then bring into the world as we're faced with people and situations we do not like, or perhaps like too much. James Finley, an excellent writer who learned at the feet of Thomas Merton. He writes, prayer as described here never touches us, as long as it remains on the surface of our lives, as long as it is nothing but one more of the 10,000 things that must be done. It's only when prayer becomes the one thing necessary that real prayer begins. Prayer begins to take on its full dimensions only when we begin to intuit that the subtle nothingness of prayer is everything. Each moment, we can choose to be empty for God. So let's not think of this as a moral obligation, but as what happens when we are consumed with love for the absolute. Everything else becomes relative. You can think of when John said at the beginning of this section on the teachings here, my God and my delight. I do this, I make prayer not just a practice, but my life, because God is my delight. Oh, to end our section here on the teachings of John, I invite you to close your eyes and take a big, deep breath. Clear your mind. Just be in the silence. And I'll say happy nothingness 3 times to lead us into a few moments of silence. Oh, happy nothingness. Oh, happy nothingness. Oh, happy nothingness. Now I invite you to be silent just for a few moments. Big, deep breath. And when you're ready, open your eyes. Oh, happy nothingness. Oh, happy nothingness. Oh, happy nothingness. Okay. Let me stop sharing here and invite you at this moment to offer any questions you may have. We got a few minutes before we go into our breakout groups. And that went a little quicker than I thought it would. And that's good. That's good. And especially if there were any times I cut out and you wanted some clarification, happy to do that. Sorry about that. I guess I'm at the Cathedral of St. Matthew right now. I guess the internet connection right near the White House is not so good. And you can take whatever message you want from that. Anyways, comments or questions from anybody? And if you don't feel like unmuting yourself, you can certainly put them in the chat. And if I don't see it, I suspect Lisa or Chris might be able to see it. And if you have a comment or question, feel free to unmute yourself if you don't want to use the chat.
I know this is not something that you didn't talk about, but I'm still struggling with a bunch of monks kidnapped him and were that violently awful to him. I'm trying to understand, like, how does that fit into everybody else's scheme of things? That is just not registering very well with me.
Yeah, that should not fit in. that was, yeah, they were pretty awful to him. Yeah.
Well, and I guess I have some thoughts about that story. To me, pop psychology in the modern media refers to the Stockholm syndrome. And I wonder if that's just a shallow interpretation of what St. John of the Cross went through.
Possibly, yeah. Yeah, I mean, he had a
jail, comfort zone,
Yeah, he had 2 jailers while he was in prison, and one of them was the one who took him to the dining room regularly and had him beaten. Now he wasn't like, punched and kicked. They had a specific rod they would use to wipe. Now it was still pain. Don't mistake it. It was still painful and terrible, but it was enough so that he wasn't totally destroyed, so that they could, take it out on him the next day. But then the second jailer came along, and that was maybe a few months in, and he was much better, and he didn't take John to the dining room. So it didn't happen the entire time he was imprisoned. But nevertheless, even if it happens once, right, that's pretty terrible. But it's hard to communicate just how fanatical Spain was at this time. This is the same time as the Spanish Inquisition. Same exact time. So there are, and that this is true of every age. There are people who use religion for their own ends, just like they'll use anything, right, for their own ends. And then there are people who are more into their own ideas about religion, and they're just punitive people to begin with. Someone hurt them when they were kids, and so they take it out on others, right? So talk about, just kind of pop psychology there, Russell, right? There's likely some people in that Carmelite monastery who were just cruel to begin with, and the culture was cruel. There was a cruel culture at the time.
Thank you.
I'm probably way out in left field, but wasn't flagellation and self-flagellation considered as a spiritual practice?
Yeah.
As a spiritual discipline?
Yes. Yeah. And hair shirts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the idea was
way of detaching you from those appetites.
Yeah. Well, that's the idea was the body is sinful, and the only way to deal with the body is to hurt it, more or less, right? And now there's, and I just saw Ken here put a great comment in the chat. He's intrigued by, oh, I just lost the chat. He's intrigued by the notion, choose to be empty for God. Now it's funny, actually, Beverly, you bring that up because they're not unrelated. It's just that the phrase "choose to be empty for God" is not to be taken, literally. It means that when I have the itch of an attachment, I choose not to scratch it.
Mhm.
So it's I've got the itch to complain about my boss. The choice to be empty for God means I choose not to do that. And for John of the Cross, that means I instead of doing that, I pray. Instead of doing that, I kind of sink into this silence, this emptiness, what he calls the happy nothingness. And I have to maybe physically, and emotionally suffer a little bit because I really want to complain. Right? It's not at all the same as whipping myself, but there's a little bit of discomfort at least involved because I'm so used to the kind of the high, you might say, of complaining about my boss. Yeah, hope that helps, Ken, and I can elaborate further if you need to. And Beverly, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Great questions.
It's wide open for any interpretation from my end of the spectrum.
Yeah. And if you'll stay close to John's meaning if you interpret it mainly as a way of prayer, as a way of meeting God in silence. That's what he means by it. Any other comments or questions?
Just a comment and maybe a question in it from me. I'm so very struck by the idea of we go into contemplative prayer and we perhaps meet God there. There's some indication that God is present and there is joy and happiness in that. But for anybody that's ever been in a place of spiritual dryness, and I'm sure everyone has, or God forbid, taken to the refectory day by day and beaten in front of all the monks, it's kind of hard to find joy in hope and in faith that God is there when it feels like God isn't. So there's clearly some spiritual mastery going on in John of the Cross that I, for one, certainly, fall very, very short of. That making that leap when it all is silent and it feels like God isn't present, to still find joy in that nothingness that's pretty advanced, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right, Chris, because there's times I know I'm sitting in my silent prayer and it sucks.
Yeah.
I don't like it at all. Yeah, but then the wisdom here is pretty spot on in terms of Jesus' teaching. John just says, keep doing it, keep at it, and he's not promising that it's going to flower into the sweetest thing you've ever tasted, and it'll be like that 24/7 right away at least. But I have noticed that there is a subtle joy, very subtle, that begins to birth as I continue in silent prayer and as I persevere. It's not all the time, certainly, and it's almost like a very light touch of peace, even when my thoughts are buzzing around my head.
The first gift is that sense of calm.
Yeah, calm. Mm-hmm.
And presumably that spills with us out into the real world, if you will, where we're constantly bombarded with desires and appetites and needs to prove ourselves and, whatever it is on a minute-to-minute basis, that we're able to bring some of the calm of that happy nothingness with us.
That's exactly why I wanted to share that story about the beautiful woman with you. Why? Because it was so very typical of his age. Again, think he was imprisoned and beaten, right, in a monastery. So it would have been very typical for him to beat the woman and drive her off, and instead he sits with her. There is so much wisdom there. So I would say that when I'm experiencing an attachment, a selfish desire, that maybe the point isn't to drive it off, but to sit with it. Right? And because John sits with this woman, it's funny, the biographer Richard Hardy says, he clearly remembered the story because he told this story when he was, much older. So it's like something that impressed on his mind. It's like, this really beautiful woman wanted to be with me. Something that he remembered, right? And yet, instead of, running away from it, he sat with it. He sat with her, right? In gentleness and calmness. So Beverly, what you just said, the calmness that comes, where he got that from years of prayer. Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
I think you take that calmness out in the world. For me, what
Yeah.
it does for me is it makes me able to meet life as it comes to me.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. That's exactly the story of this beautiful woman. John meets life as it comes to him. Yeah. Yeah, very much. And the gentleness, right?
Characteristics you notice in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Hey, what, right?
Everything in the world with that calm.
Yeah, exactly.
And he wanted a seat at the table too. That was the other piece that kind of jumped out at me with this young lady.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Any other comments or thoughts? Great comments, guys. I'm really engaged with that. That's great.
The one thing that's coming, I don't know why this is coming to me in this way. I've never thought about it this way before, but am I? Again, I feel like I'm getting feedback.
I don't know why you're echoing.
Well, I'll save it for my small group. Never mind.
It's better now, Lisa.
Oh, tell us.
Okay, all right. I think I'm okay now. What was I going to say? Oh, so when we were talking about that, that inner contemplative, quiet, nothingness, and having difficulty maybe equating that place with joy, almost like they don't go together. And I've never thought about this before, but you've sort of created in my mind the notion of an extroverted joy and an introverted joy. And I think when we talk about joy, I think about I'm singing joy to the world. I'm thinking about that extroverted, like sort of joy looks like something. It has a sound to it, it has an energy to it. And I almost feel like we've defined another kind of joy, no less real. And it's still joy, but that's kind of helpful to me to think about how, we talk about how joy and suffering can sit side by side. It's a little easier to understand when I think about that internal, more introverted joy rather than that sort of outburst of, the one that looks more like happiness.
And yet he also had that. I didn't cover it in his biography, but John loved nature. He was the happiest with nature, and he loved his family. In fact, his mother, Catalina, and his brother, what's his brother's name? Gonzalo, I think. Gonzalo and his wife, not Gonzalo. Gonzalo was his dad. I can't remember his brother's name, but his brother and his brother's wife and his mother, they moved around with John, John of the Cross. So wherever John went, other than Toledo, was because he was abducted, they followed him to Avila. They followed him to Granada. They followed him to Ubeda, and they were just there with him. He loved his family. He loved going out in nature. He loved simple pleasures. So it's not like there's no sense that the world is bad. Like that one paragraph we read where life is miserable, he's really reflecting on how we're confused about where true happiness is found. And yet once we kind of get the happiness in the nothingness, then actually, Lisa, that extroverted joy becomes even more natural, perhaps. And even when Mother Teresa is a good example of this, another Carmelite, Saint Teresa of Lisieux, is a good example of this. They're going through the deepest darkness of the dark night, and yet they're happy. Because, to go back to what Chris was bringing up, they just kept praying. They just kept praying. And then kind of almost sometimes, you know, that phrase, fake it until you make it, almost sometimes leaning into the joy, even if they didn't feel it. Yeah. Anything else?
Well, you said he loved his family, and it
He
strikes
did.
me that his family loved him.
Yeah.
Oh, to all those places with him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Must have been something magnetic. And maybe it was that inner joy, that calm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, again, he was a small person, even for his time. Why was this really beautiful woman attracted to him? And I think it's pretty obvious that not just maybe he was sort of handsome, although no one really talks about how he looks. It's the magnetism of holiness. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. I think so.
Mm.
If just being, you're just someone who is at peace with themselves. He's someone who at peace with himself and knows God, and there's a kind of holistic joy to that, a holistic peace that just exudes, right? So yeah, like Peg, you were saying, you bring the calm, the gentleness, the delight. You bring delight into the world just by being who you are. That's John of the Cross very much. And if you read his poetry, there's actually a lot of that. That's a great term, Lisa, extroverted joy. A lot of extroverted joy if you read his poetry. All about love and delight and how energized and enthusiastic he is about God. But it's always got to be read in the context of this kind of nothingness, this darkness. Yeah, both. That's always the sign of a good mystic, when they can kind of hold both light and dark, you know, joy and sorrow kind of together. Yeah.
And the word lavish was his, not your
The word lavish is actually from Ian Matthew, who is a current modern day Carmelite and a writer, but it really does capture the kind of the sense of intense giving that John portrays in God. Sheer grace would be the term John uses, or he just uses love, 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 love all over the place. Yeah.
You
But
know,
that's a good way to capture the idea in one word: lavish. Yeah.
lavish.
Okay. Well, then I think we're good. Lisa, I turn it over to you for our small groups.
So you have some questions to consider. If for any reason you lose them when you get to your breakout room, give me a holler and I'll come in and send them your way. But we'll just take it's 8:35. We'll take maybe 15 minutes to address these questions with our smaller groups, and then we'll join back together once more in case anything comes up that we want to ask LJ about, or just to let him tie things up at the end. So in a moment, you'll be invited to join your breakout room, and we'll see you there. Well, I'm going to turn things back over. LJ, if you want to take any additional questions or find out what has come out of breakout rooms, and then you can wrap up as however you see fit. I know Chris is going to give us a few closing announcements before we do that. But
Before
first,
we do that,
you want to ask, or do you want to do that first?
whatever, I'm easy.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to remind everyone of some upcoming events. First of all, the remaining 2 sessions of John of the Cross with LJ. So it'll be next week, next Tuesday, and then February 4th. Next week will be just like tonight on Zoom, and then February 4th will be in person at St. Aidan's.
You mean 11th, do you? For the
I'm sorry.
third?
Yes, February 4th and February 11th.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for, thanks. So February 11th will be in person. We'll be in the sanctuary, 7:30 program, and we'll have a 6:30 simple communal meal.
Oh, good.
That
That
maybe
potluck or what, Chris?
say that again.
Is
Beverly?
that potluck? Should we bring something?
I guess it wouldn't hurt to bring something. I think there will be soup there, and then bread, and I heard reference to pies. So yeah, bring a little something. It'll
That
be
sounds
nice.
like more than enough food to me. I
Yeah,
want.
I think
There
so.
will be plenty unless you are bursting with inspiration.
Okay.
Well said.
Okay.
I'd also mention that February 9th, 4 to 5:15 at the church, we're doing tea and Teilhard, following up on our initial discussion of the film. So we'll be discussing the film and doing some film clips, and I guess it wouldn't hurt to watch the movie ahead of time. We bring something to that. And then again, check the Center for Spiritual Deepening website for information on that. And then February 23rd, that will be a Sunday, the 5:30 service. We'll do Teilhard's Mass on the World instead of our
Oh, I
normal
love it.
and there will be a potluck supper in association with that too. So it is Teilhard season, or the year of Teilhard for us. Spiritual
Wonderful.
resilience. And that's all I got. So we can't wait to see you all next week.
Thank you, Chris.
Wow. It's a nice little connection then to John of the Cross here, that Teilhard says joy is the most infallible sign of God's presence.
There you go.
Yeah.
Sounds to me like we're on the right track.
Anything pressing that anyone wanted to say from their groups?
So where does St. John of the Cross come from? What's the cross connection? Is it the cross as you mentioned earlier? That's what we were talking about.
Where did his name come from? So it was the convention at the time to take a religious name, like a name for the particular community you entered. So he was born Juan de Yepes, and then he became a regular Carmelite. He took Juan de Santa, oh my goodness, Santa Matia.
Okay,
And
so
then
Matthew.
the joining of the Reformed Carmelites, San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross.
Oh,
So I'm not sure why he chose the cross, except it's the
okay.
cross.
Okay.
Peg, you're muted. Peg, we're not hearing you because you're still muted.
I would say he had a real cross to bear. I don't know whether he did that before or after he was in prison.
After. The cross to bear came after, certainly.
Well, I know, but
Well,
St. John of the Cross, whether that came before or after, I don't know.
yeah. You know, his childhood was a cross to bear too. He had a lot of extreme poverty. I mean, the reason he's probably so small is that he was malnourished.
Oh, wow.
We were wondering about what influence his mother had on his early life and then into the spiritual path.
Okay, I'll tell you this story quickly. I should have included this in the biography, but Juan grew up with his mother Catalina telling him the story of how she and Gonzalo, John's dad, fell in love. So it was a real romance, kind of lifted out of the pages of a romance novel almost. Gonzalo was from a wealthy family. Catalina was from a very poor family. Chose to leave his riches out of love.
Oh,
His wife, his beloved Catalina, at the bottom. In fact, Gonzalo's family said, "If you go and be with this woman, Catalina, we disown you."
Wow. Okay.
No problem. I love her that much.
Okay.
So it's no problem for John to say, "Oh, God loves me lavishly," because I have this great example in my dad and in my mom.
Right.
And then his mom pours herself out after Gonzalo dies, pours herself out just trying to keep John and his brothers alive. So it's just immensely. His mother and his dad influenced him immensely. Yeah.
oh, wow.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Sure. And other than just keeping him going to church, just notice what I said. It was normal everyday actions that mom showed her love for her boys, and then Gonzalo choosing to be with his wife. That's nothing, super extraordinary, like going to the missions and healing lepers, whatever. It's normal human love.
So his father's family never came around after the father passed away to kind of help them out or offer to help them out.
One of them sort of did. and took the boys for like a summer while Catalina was trying to make some money. But they really didn't. Yeah, they really didn't.
Great.
Anything else?
A
All right, well,
thousand
then let me
questions.
end with this one sentence. We had it in the slides, but it's one to take home. It's saying 28, and it's when John writes, "The very pure spirit does not bother about the regard of others or human respect, but communes inwardly with God, alone and in solitude as to all forms, and with delightful tranquility. For the knowledge of God is received in divine silence."
Oh,
Beautiful.
Thank you very much. I moved into a different room that hopefully there wasn't any glitching, and hopefully that doesn't happen next week. And I can't promise I won't glitch in person the following week, but we'll try. Thank you for your patience tonight with that.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah. Thank
LJ.
you.
Thanks,
Oh,
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Take
You're
care.
welcome.
Bye-bye.
Everybody,
Bye, everybody.